We have the pleasure of having Christine, a health and science reporter with CBC National News here. Please join me in welcoming her, and she's going to conduct the next portion of the program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, guys. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with all of you, and incredibly inspiring to hear all that each and every one of you has, in some cases, attempted and accomplished. I wish I could say I was rejected to be an astronaut. and I'd like to say that it's all that you've accomplished so far, because I'm sure there is much more to come. During this panel discussion, we're going to dig a bit deeper into the passion that each of you have for what you're doing now. We heard bits of it. But I'd also like to start by reading you a tweet. This is not breaking news of any kind, but it caught me off guard. I saw it over the weekend. It was from what I can tell, it's an American. His name was Matthew Hanchard. And I'd like to get thoughts on this. And I told the panelists individually, I'll start with one of you, but you guys are welcome to chime in and say whatever suits you in the moment if you've got an idea or a thought. So the tweet was from Matthew Hanchard, "Help. My 5-year-old daughter just told me girls can't be scientists because they're not as clever as boys." That is the reaction that I had. And this is not reading something from, 30 years ago. This is this weekend on Twitter. I wanted to start off asking you guys about spark. Where does the spark, this is a 5-year-old girl, and it seems like to her, she doesn't even see the possibility of the spark. So I'd love to hear, and I'll start with you, Inmar, where did the spark to do what you do come from? And what your thoughts are on hearing a comment like that in 2018.
I was, I guess many women in STEM, I was always interested in math and science and knowledge and reading up on animals and minerals and things. And I knew growing up that I wanted to keep doing that. So I don't know that I know where my spark comes from. I definitely had the privilege of having a family that didn't question that and let me do what I wanted. They accepted some pretty weird decisions that I've made over the years, like packing up and moving to Toronto just because. And I've had the luck. I've been lucky. Things have worked out for me. But I think if I had to have this conversation with this little girl, I would probably start where I start with the people that I manage. I would ask her, why does she think that way? And hope that somewhere in the conversation, after I've heard her piece, I would still be able to say that this is simply not true and share some of what I know about why it's not true.
Marianne, I saw you lean towards your mic. I know you mentioned exploration was a bit of your spark. What would be your advice, though, and your thoughts?
It's a good question. It's also hard to pinpoint maybe an exact moment. I give a lot of credit to my family and my parents. I mean, growing up, I have a twin brother as well. We're the youngest of the 4 kids. We are very different, like wildly different. And I would say academically, we were very different. And I guess there was never barriers placed from a family point of view. I actually did very well academically in school. I think that construct worked well. It didn't work well for my brother. He's brilliant. He can build lasers. And so I'm very conscious of that too, of the ways we learn and where we do learning. And that's particularly my work now. I think about this a lot. Learning that happens outside of school. Often people, when they talk about a spark, it tends to be from a family experience or something that happened outside of school. And so I'm really curious around that recognition of learning as, of course, something we do in school, but throughout our whole lives, including at home. So anyway, that's a larger topic. I'm happy to dive into it.
I think the question we should be asking is who kills the spark? Because it's not that people don't have them. It's not that magically, like, men have this, thing where they're super into science and math and girls just don't. we need, more than most of the time, we need to get out of the way when women are already interested in STEM. It's, that 5-year-old girl is coming up against somebody telling her something that she already, knows to be true is not true. So I think the question needs to be like flipped a little bit to say, what are we doing to stop the spark that women and girls already have in going into STEM?
But I think that tweet has two problems, okay? Problem number one is women can't be in science, and I think they can, and I think we need to have ways to promote that, and I think the woman from McMaster who won the Nobel Prize this year for physics is a very classic example. But the second question is, why is it that girls are not as smart as boys? I think that's the worst part of the tweet, and where that is being ingrained in that young girl's mind or in whoever put that forward.
Marianne, did you want to?
I guess just what comes to mind, and I'm locating myself again as a critical scholar and thinker, is what we would call symbolic violence, and the idea that we can start to internalize these ideas, even particularly as women, ideas around how we're expected to behave, and looking at the power of the imagination and the power of mentorship. And this is a lot of what I do around thinking for Indigenous youth, seeing yourself in positions, aspiring to do things means seeing yourself represented in careers across the spectrum, in leadership roles, et cetera. And so rather than internalizing a stereotyped idea around how people are being perceived, how can we do the opposite?
Now, just as a note, I left this part out, but I'll read you the rest of his tweet, was that he goes on to ask for recommendations for child-friendly resources, and he puts not sarcastic memes, which I'm sure he got a lot of anyway. But in response, he actually had over 2,000 replies to that Twitter message. And they were from women all around the world. There were photos, there were stories, there were offers to talk with his daughter from women in various fields in science. And his response was he actually responded to every single reply he received. It was something kind of magical, I thought, and I thought it led very nicely to this conversation. Huda, I want to pick up on something you mentioned about the reverse, who killed the spark. So let's talk barriers. What do you think? You guys are all very accomplished. You've reached this point in your careers and in your life so far. What has been the biggest barrier to getting to this moment?
I think a lot of it is perception, right? We're used to seeing things be a certain way, done a certain way. So when someone comes along and they don't fit the mold of what we expect a scientist or an astronaut to look like, we're like, hey, what are you doing here? And I think it was the same for me. So I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, and what I think the public perception of people in Saudi is that women are super repressed. Women represent over 60% of all life science and engineering grads in the country of Saudi Arabia, which is not something I can say for Canada. So when I came here, that was the biggest culture shock, where I was like, wait a minute, I'm one of 1 to 4 ratio of engineers in my school. It's a lot better now, but the perception that I was coming into was people were saying, well, you don't look like an engineer. Or why are you an entrepreneur? Why are you in this room full of men asking to raise your next venture round for your business? You don't look like the other people who come in and raise money. So I think the barriers are more so, what people think is okay in certain industries. And that was definitely true for me. So Dot Health is a venture-backed business. Around this time last year, we raised our first round of financing, and I did 80 pitches to venture capitalist groups across North America. And one of them stands out as actually a firm right here in Toronto, quite well known. And we have a 100% female leadership team. And I put up that slide. You usually put up a slide to show, like, this is the team, this is what we're building, this is, why it would be a good idea for you to invest in us now. We're gonna, blow up in the future. And on the team slide, we're three of us, and then we're all female. And one of the partners was like, wait a minute, are you trying to prove some political point here? And I was like, I don't know what you mean. And he's like, well, why is your leadership team all women? And I was like, because they're really good at what they do. That's why. And he's like, and he picked on my CTO, who is brilliant. He's like, is she really qualified to be your chief technology officer? And those are questions I didn't get when I had a male co-founder and I was going in speaking to some of the same people. So I think those are, there are certain perceptions people have, and those responses would stop a lot of people. I think it made me pause and be like, whoa, I never thought this would happen to me. I've read about it.
Inmar, I see you nodding and a cracking smile.
There is one thing that I do challenge people to do when I sit on these panels, and I think, what can I say that maybe will stick with people? And I think we can play this game with Huda's experience, which is I challenge people to think when they talk to, and going back to little girls and little boys, to ask themselves in their head, would I be saying the same thing if it was a different gender? And I don't think anyone would be asking, hey, are you trying to make a political point by having an all-men panel of leaders, right? That is just not a reasonable question, and we shouldn't be asking these questions at the same time. So in the same way. So I think the barriers start before the baby is even born. It starts when the well-meaning friends go to buy something for the gift, the baby shower, and they pick things that have colors that are associated with women or girls, and they pick the cute princess, like all of these things that tell a story to women about what they should be focusing on. And when I see beautiful little girls, I make it a point to never say, oh, you're so pretty, because we don't say it to the boys. And it tells that girl something. It tells her what's important, what she should be focusing on, and I think that's a problematic message. So in terms of my career, I've had difficult challenges. I definitely felt there were places where I wasn't given the role or the title or the responsibilities that I was ready to take because I was a woman. I fight for that. If I don't succeed and I feel like I'm not in the right place, then sometimes that makes me move on. But that's part of the journey.
Lisa, I heard you mention that you have a twin brother.
Oh, Marianne.
Oh, sorry,
yeah,
Marianne.
it's okay.
Sorry.
I do, yes.
So can you relate? Is there anything going back that you saw that you were challenged differently?
That's a great question. And I have to say, I don't think I've actually thought about this topic until maybe the last 3 years. Like, I don't think I looked through my career through this gender lens in terms of seeing barriers. And I can recognize them now and see microaggressions, but I think as I was living them, I didn't recognize it at the time. And that might just be an assessment of the time. So it's really, I feel like, only the last 3 years in me gaining knowledge about systemic barriers and things that now I'm able to reflect back. It's hard to think about my childhood because I really, I don't see it. I don't know. And I had qualities that I was the athletic one. I was the smart one in terms of grades compared to my brother. So we had different strengths that were seen in different ways. And I just think of my parents as being supportive of both of us. We were never compared by grades, by anything. And so I'm very conscious of that all the time. My partner now, my husband, is someone who didn't go, I went on through a PhD, and he's someone who was an entrepreneur out of high school. And I have equal value in my mind for these experiences. And I think it's very common in academia to maybe value our experience as the path. But there are many ways. So I'm not really, it's hard for me to think back on that reflection. Yeah.
Lisa, you can tell Nick, I'm so sorry. I actually work with Lisa's husband, Nick Purdon, who's at the CBC. We always say, you're only as good as your last story. I'm only as good as my last panel. I'm sorry I got your name wrong. I wonder how you turn that lens on. I do think there are a number of barriers, especially when it comes to talking about Indigenous health.
I obviously am a strong advocate around Indigenous health equity, and I speak about and work to transform the experiences that our peoples have in the healthcare system. But I always say it's really hard to speak about, the care that someone's getting for an acute myocardial infarction when I'm also up in communities where a chief is telling me we've got a problem with all these soft tissue infections because we don't have access to water in 85% of our homes. And we don't, our funding for education on reserve is much, much less than that of the funding that someone gets off reserve. So we've got like major systemic and structural barriers. I didn't face those as I explained in my story. That are we need to get everyone up to the same playing field and the same plane and the start point. And the same starting line means food, clothing, and shelter. I remember my projects in geography in grade 4. It's like food, clothing, and shelter. Let's get some basic standards and let's have equality there, the same standards, and then we'll be at a similar playing field. Then we need to deal with all of the systemic racism. So, but I feel like we're at this incredible time of transformation in that there was, like Louis Riel talked about how the artists would make the change, and we're seeing all of this incredible work that's happening amongst our Indigenous leaders and Indigenous artists who are inspiring imagination and inspiring different ways of being and knowing across society. And we're seeing that amongst all of these incredible Indigenous youth now who are coming into science and coming into medical school and asking different questions in science too, right? Because, understanding the interconnectedness of all things. It's people are coming from a really different ontologic and a standpoint around the way we may look at the world. So it's pretty exciting in terms of seeing those possibilities.
Going back just a step, I know you mentioned during your presentation Donna Haraway. I wanted to talk about mentors. And I know we've also heard the encouragement of being mentors. I wondered what her presence meant to you.
Well, she was like, the cool thing about Donna Haraway, she was a theoretical presence, right? I happened to work with my supervisor in graduate school, happened to have been a student of Donna Haraway, so she was never someone she's not someone I've met and worked with, but I worked with her, with one of her mentees. And I think that that's really neat, to think that our mentors or the people who inspire us may not even be people whom we actually meet, but they may be people whose work we read about or we see on a panel or hear about in the news. And so particularly, again, around the mentorship for folks who are underrepresented, I think that's really powerful and important.
Sharon, you had talked about being a mentor and how it's something that brings you a lot of joy. Talk to us about what that means.
Well, I think, being a mentor, sort of helps in many ways. It helps someone think about what their possibilities may be. But I think the more important thing is how to open the doors to enable somebody to use their potential to its fullest. So I'll give an example, which was an incredible story. Is again, I like the gym, and I shared a personal trainer with another woman at the gym, and the trainer was going to have a baby. So we went to the baby shower with the pink and everything. But anyway, at the baby shower, this woman's daughter was there, and she says, "Oh, I've never really thought about medicine." So she was an undergraduate student, and so we brought her into the clinic, and she worked with us as a summer student, and then she had the opportunity to present her research at the International AIDS Conference, and so then she decided she would do medical school, and then she did infectious disease, and now she's one of the leading physicians here in Toronto. So, I mean, just those kinds of opportunities, which are absolutely fortuitous in terms of us making this connection at a baby shower to change really her entire career path. And I think the mentor that I had, opened my door as well. I sort of told the story that my first night as a physician, I saw the first case of HIV, and we brought over the infectious disease physician at the time, and he says, "What? You should run with this. Why don't you be the leader in this disease?" And so I went home, and as an intern, I was going around the city doing the presentations about HIV. And so it was just providing me that opportunity, giving me support, and giving me independence to allow me to take that to my capacity.
I found that striking when you told that moment how deeply it impacted you to be there and not know, almost a sense of helplessness. Yeah. About how do I help this person, and then to take that on. Has anybody else sort of had that same sort of aha moment?
I think the aha moment for me was more about how much you learn from the people you mentor, and how much it is a two-way thing. So it's not just me spending time with people who may benefit from what I have to say, but it's me benefiting from what they teach me, what I see in them, the conversations we have. So it's a very rewarding thing to do.
Did you want to add?
No, I think I had mentioned an aha moment when I was talking, but it's funny.
It's The Rock.
Dr. Jackie Mukai is this Japanese astronaut. That was my aha moment. But leading up to then, I always thought like, oh, maybe I'll have one. Like kind of waiting for this like magical moment to happen. I'm like, maybe it just doesn't work out that way for people, you know, and, you know, in my meandering path or whatever. And then when that moment happened, I was like, oh my gosh, I think this is one of those moments. and I realized what I didn't mention in the talk, but reflecting and hearing this discussion is, I think what she kind of opened up for me was this view of access to this world of space exploration in this connected teamwork approach. Not from this competitive and purely technology. It was this team dynamic approach that really attracted me to kind of pursuing that work. So it was just a different lens on the work.
All right, so let's flip the topic. I know we've talked now a lot about some of the barriers, but what advantages do women have in science, in your opinion? Huda, why don't we start with you?
I was hoping you wouldn't start with me. I did not have.
You said you
an
wanted this to
answer
be
ready.
challenging.
I do. You're right. I think it's interesting when we look at areas where maybe women haven't made as many inroads. I think the biggest opportunity comes back to what kind of a role model or example you can be for other women coming after you, because so many have done that for me. So every time I think about sort of this new, area that is yet to be conquered by, a woman entrepreneur, it encourages me in a very different way. But fundamentally, I think, when we look at certain things that, men and women are good at, I don't think you can isolate that to gender. But what I find fascinating is when people talk about great leaders, they talk about things, what do you need in order to be a good leader? A lot of those qualities are often attributes that we assign to women. But the moment it comes to women leaders, all we can think of is the negative thing. So, for example, good leaders need to be like very emotionally intelligent. And often we talk about how women are more emotionally intelligent than men. Good leaders tend to be able to multitask, and there are many often women are told that they're good multitaskers. So then, what sort of change it. So when I look at anyone entering a field that isn't an area that has been exemplified by a woman, the things I'm thinking of is what are the qualities that you already have that already fit the bill of this area, and how can you come in and use those as your power and as your leverage?
And Mar, what do you think? Advantages that you've brought to where you are that maybe is unique?
I'm not thinking so much about myself, but about the people I work with. And women do need to work harder to be assessed at the same level. So you're going to have to apply yourself harder to the problem. You're going to have to prove yourself more. There are studies showing that women get promoted based on performance, whereas men get promoted based on potential. So you need to have that performance there to get to the next level. And I think the advantage in a way in that is that when I work with the women on my team, I get to push them harder and I get to see more exciting results. So I kind of enjoy that privilege. I don't know if they enjoy it, but it's kind of amazing to see what people do when you set a high bar for them and get them to rise there. So leverage on the fact that they're already in that world where they need to work harder and seeing how far we can go with it.
Mm-hmm. Lisa?
So without, not wanting to gender this too much, but speaking about my own experience. So I had my children while I was a resident, so I was working at that point. We didn't quite have the same work hour restrictions on our training, so I was doing 80 to 100 hours a week of of work and was pregnant and was then, after my babies were born, was, I was trying to balance everything. What that gave me, and again, coming back to why I think Donna Haraway's teaching has been so important, is that gave me constant perspective. So I might have had, I remember saying to one of the old school gastroenterology professors during a rotation who was questioning me in a very particular way, and I remember just saying to him, I'm really sorry, Dr. So-and-so, but this style of questioning is actually really intimidating for me, and it's not working very well. And I remember thinking, okay, well, there we go. I just blew that rotation for sure. I'm going to be lucky if I pass that. And I realized that what gave me the courage to do that and just to be honest and specific about what my needs were at that time was that I had this whole other world around me that was keeping me very focused and grounding me in what I knew was important, which was, family, culture, and a life outside of medicine. So that, although I see that I alluded to the physical challenge of having to do that, I realize now that was a huge gift, to use the kind of language that we would say in our world. It gave me this perspective that was really valuable and helpful.
And I think you probably had the voice and that perspective that a lot of women have had, but maybe not had the courage to necessarily say in an interview that they feel is that pivotal in their careers. So that's actually, that's pretty amazing. Sharon?
Well, I'd like to think that the positions that I have acquired have been as a result of hard work, dedication, enthusiasm, that drive, and the skills and the ability. But I must say, being a woman sometimes is an advantage because I was in a man's world, and I was one of the few women who stepped forward, who was willing to travel, who was willing to speak, who was willing to do the research. And because there weren't a whole lot of women in there, I often got opportunities that some of my male colleagues wouldn't get. So there were some advantages there. But I agree with Lisa. I think that it's the big picture, and it's having balance in your life, and it's not just your job, but there's other things that you do. I think that women are very good at multitasking and doing multiple things. I think it's having the people around you, and I have a husband, thanks to Paula, who introduced us, of being very supportive and understanding of what I do and not being threatened by what I do. And then my team. My team is crucial. Without my research team supporting me, when I'm away, I know that things are working, and I know that I can count on them, and that the work is being done, and that we're continuing to push forward those boundaries even when I'm not there.
Just a full disclosure, I asked her after she told me that you had introduced her to her husband, I asked her, do you still like her? But obviously, he sounds amazing. I think we're winding down on my time for questions, so I want to make sure that you guys are coming up with your questions, and I'm just going to pitch one more here, and don't be shy. Don't be shy. Ask whatever questions. This is such a unique opportunity. You know, as a journalist, there are moments when you sit in a room with people who know things that you've never even imagined, and this is one of those opportunities where you can ask questions about things you simply want to know, and all of these women are incredibly accessible. Finally, I wanted to ask you guys about advancing women in science. We've heard it throughout this panel, throughout this discussion this afternoon, about the leadership positions that women are not entering at times. All of you have had success in this. What do you feel needs to happen to see more of this type of success? Marianne, I'll start with you since you haven't talked for a while.
Interesting enough, so our organization recently had a webinar on women in STEM and talking about different, I guess you would say, interventions in helping women be in STEM. And there are many different things that people try and do. And one of the top ones was education around the issue. And that caught me. I'm like, wow, just recognizing and acknowledging that there are systemic barriers, and just bringing that to someone's attention. And once I heard that, I'm like, huh. Because again, when I started thinking about this maybe 3 or 4 years ago, recognizing that, I have imposter syndrome, and getting knowledge about that and having that self-awareness, or knowing that when I go in to negotiate for a salary raise, that I might not be asking enough because of these internal barriers I have. So that knowledge and my ability then to develop strategies, I think are really helpful. So I can see that in my own life, and I can see how that kind of first step of education and awareness, and then around, what we can do. And of course, let's break down the system. Let's get to the root of it. But that was really eye-opening for me.
All right. Aside from tear it all down, how do we encourage more women to get into STEM, Sharon?
Well, I think, as Christy said today, a recognition that we don't have equality, and opening up these new Canada Research chairs, and I confess I'm going to apply, certainly is starting to push that. But my comment to you when she said 43%, I said, why isn't it 50%? And I think we need to continue to push. And that's what I've had to do in my research as well for my patients, is most of the work in HIV was all around gay men. And the disease is different for women. Women come at it through a different lens. They come at it through different risk factors. They struggle with different things. And we just can't apply that research from men to women. And so we have pushed over the years. We now have the companies doing women-only trials so that we can understand the therapies in women themselves. I founded and now chair an international workshop on HIV and women's research. So we just have to keep pushing that barrier and keep saying that we need to look at this in many ways.
Lisa, let's talk about medical students. Roughly half of the medical students who enter are women. Very few enter positions of leadership. What do you feel needs to happen there?
So I feel really strongly about changing structures and systems, because we can have many heroes who do unbelievable work, but what we need to do is we need to make sure those changes are sustainable. So we are fortunate enough in our Department of Medicine to have a phenomenal chair who's very committed to equity. And examples of structural things that can happen are simple. On a search committee, we have everyone do implicit bias training now before the search committee. There has to be a particular makeup for a search committee, meaning you need diverse representation there. We actually don't, because of the research showing that reference letters for men and women are quite different, in that the reference letters for women use what are called the grindstone adjectives, meaning work hard, conscientious, etc., as opposed to, and the reference letters for men generally point to cognitive ability, and other areas. We actually have eliminated reference letters at the around the first round, and they're used actually after a person has been selected in order to support and to make sure that you've selected the right candidate. So those are, specific small steps, but they're example of what I like about them of policy and structural change. We need to have targets, and I often hear from people, well, we're not able to find enough people to apply for this position. Well, then I turn it around and say, well, where are we advertising? Who are we recruiting? What is the barrier there? Because it means we're not reaching the right communities, the right people. We know that, women may be less likely to actually put themselves forward for a position, so it means we have now strategies around mentorship where mentors are saying, you know what, you need to apply for this. We need to make sure we have a certain number of people. So I think that is really critical. And then the discourse around the flip side of that, when we start using, quote, targets, is I hear a lot of this backlash, oh, this is all affirmative action. And so what we're also doing in our department is critiquing this idea of the meritocracy, because what you realize is that the people who are succeeding based on all of these, maybe doing so based on implicit biases, and we're not recognizing the bias in things like our reference letters. So making sure that we're actually stating this is a meritocracy, and having this diverse representation and leadership is actually going to enhance our faculty.
Absolutely. Those are a lot of really great points. Huda, you had mentioned female CEO, engineer, a lot of things that people don't put together. How do we clone you?
I think I'm a super average chick. Like, I don't actually think there's anything about me that's like, that stands out. I think and each of us have actually touched on the fact that someone somewhere gave us that sort of light bulb moment. And I think, how do we replicate a lot of those moments for people? And I think, when it comes to women not putting themselves forward for leadership positions, or the way we build companies, or the way we build boards, we unfortunately have very, very little data in Canada specifically around female leadership. But I remember a couple years ago, the Globe and Mail did a survey of top 100 by revenue companies, public companies in Canada, and 98 of them had male CEOs, and just 2 of them had female CEOs. And I think, right now we live in a difficult age, because nobody, no woman in this room wants to get to an incredible position only for someone to turn around and say, you only got that because you're a woman. So I think there's a weird, we live in a little bit of an optics age, so we need to get beyond that a little bit. And I think the way we do it is wanting men to help women, but also women helping other women. Because what will often happen is we joke about it in tech, there's like an old guard of women where it is advantageous for them to be, to not have that many women in the room. That helps them stand out. But I think what we're missing is the long-term effects of what that means. It means that there will only ever be, room for just one on a, panel of 5 or whatever it is, just as like a token person. But what can each of us do in our own spheres of influence? So I'm a female CEO. What can I do in my own company? Limited sphere of influence at .health. We're a team of full-time 20 people. What can I do to promote, train, grow women to be leaders within my organization? So, most technology companies are saying, oh, right, everyone's asking us how we're doing on gender balance. Let's just hire a bunch of women in grunt work roles. Well, okay, how do we start incentivizing organizations, hospitals, whatever it is, how do we start incentivizing them to say, you actually need to have equal numbers of men and women at every layer? Because that's the only way this is gonna work. We can't just have, men be the highest influencers and women being sort of like the bottom rung, because for them to then sort of cross that chasm is really difficult.
Mm-hmm. But that's often the quick fix, There is a hiring spree, and they're not decision makers by any means.
So I like making lists, and I'm thinking here, sitting here thinking I should make a list to answer this question, because I can talk about this for hours. And I'm having another thought, which is most minorities suffer from some form of bias and discrimination. We are not a minority, right? So that should be working for us, because there are many of us. There are, as I alluded to, the problem starts even before the baby is born. Every step of the way, things happen that are not advantageous for women and are keeping women back. So I don't have the one thing that is going to help fix the problem. But what I do try to do is figure out ways that I can personally help. And that's something that I've been doing for the last probably 11 years or so, and it changes over time, because I started as, the first bit, I guess, was becoming aware, right? So going to educating myself on the numbers, the statistics, the research, and being able to summarize it and explain it to other people so that they know as well, right? And then later on, when I was a bit more senior in, say, the PhD program, joining organizations that were already there to help by volunteering, by running events, by doing workshops. And then later on, starting things myself, because I was looking around and thinking, okay, I would like to join this organization, but it doesn't actually exist. So let's get together in a room and start figuring out how to get this thing off the ground. There are so many different ways in which we can try to apply our scientific thinking and problem solve. And some of them are tiny, some of them are a big undertaking, but it's one thing that I feel I can use my free time to do. And so I do it, and to give you the examples, I will need to start getting through this list, but it's something that I think anyone can do, men or women, if they think about, this is my community, this is my sphere of influence, what are the little things or the bigger things that I can do to help with the problem?
It's great. I think that sentiment is amazing because it is also just about personal connections. And I think that when you're thinking about what can I do, you reach out a hand to say, what can I do? And you build connections. And I think for women, that is incredibly important. All right, now the moment. All right, so who has a question? We have a mic that we can bring to you in the audience. I know you guys have had burning questions. These were amazing presentations.
Quite fortuitous that the microphone was right here. Meant to
Waiting
be.
for you.
I have a question for the panel regarding conflict and strategies that you have found to be effective in managing conflict in your various journeys.
Good question. Who would like to take that? Sharon, would you like to?
Oh, gee, thanks. Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, so I think we all, have conflict as part of our work, and I think the best way to deal with it is in open communication. I think that's the best way. And thinking particularly of my research team, if we have a particular problem, we sit down as a group, we discuss it through, and we look at a way forward. And I think that that's usually the best way for us to go forward.
I think I work in a field where it's all about conflict, and I'm actually, because I'm often asked to sort of manage when there has been issues of conflict, sometimes large institutional conflict around relationships with communities, for example. And what I wish I had known 10 years ago is one can learn how to do this through training. Actually, there are specific steps around conflict resolution that there are books that one can read, there are courses that one can take, and I would highly recommend them. It may be, it might be a 10-minute YouTube video, but they teach you that some of those simple strategies, like in the moment, some of that cognitive behavioral stuff, like, okay, this is very emotional. Let's say I've just heard a comment that is really upsetting. Okay, that grounding, how am I gonna manage this? This is quite an emotional thing. I'm having this emotional flooding now, taking the deep breaths, acknowledging what's going on. So I think those specific strategies are really helpful. And quite frankly, if only I had learned them, 25 years ago.
I think you brought up an interesting point about the emotional flooding. I think when there is conflict, sometimes we want to mind our tone and our reaction as a woman. And I've, at the CBC, I've seen reporters leave meetings in tears. And then the worst part of that whole meeting was just that they were in tears. It wasn't about what actually happened to them. It was just their reaction, which I think is very hard. And to have tips, to know perhaps in that moment, prior to having that meeting, it would be incredibly valuable. Mm-hmm. Great question. All right, who's next? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So I am currently in high school, as I'm sure you could guess. But and I consider myself someone who's very comfortable in a leadership position and wants to break boundaries in the STEM field. But I find that a lot of my peers specifically don't necessarily have that same level of confidence. So I know we've talked a lot about mentoring, but how could you encourage peers and help inspire them to also break boundaries and step out of the box?
Oh, that's a great question. Who would like to take that on? Inmar?
I can tell you one story that comes to mind. So a few months ago, I spoke at an all-girls school on a panel about AI that was organized by a student who felt very much the same way. She felt like she was interested in leadership. She was interested in AI as a technology. It didn't seem like anyone around her was that interested. And I guess someone, a mentor figure, told her, well, organize something. And it was amazing because a lot of people came together for that, and a lot of people got excited about it. And I think that's a good example of, her thinking out of the box and her doing. And sure enough, she had a lot of support, but basically applying a problem-solving skill to the idea. So if there is no format in your school that is already there, you can think about starting one.
But not everybody wants to be the leader, and some people are uncomfortable with that. And so there's often a way to involve people in a group. And so you have a big organization, and there may be some people that are leading more than others. And there can be a leader of a big event, but then there can be sub-leaders of smaller events. And so to get your peers more comfortable, you may have to start at a lower level than where you are, and good luck. Yeah.
Any more responses from the panel?
I think in response to that question, and maybe some other ones earlier, this idea of you're already, it sounds like a leader, and this concept of sharing the platform, of sharing the opportunity. So not always being the one stepping up in the leadership, but sharing that opportunity maybe with your peers, someone who might not have as much confidence. I think about this a lot in our work as well. I'm frequently on panels. Should it be me? Should I be encouraging other people in this opportunity? When we're talking about women in STEM, but really the broader lens of diversity, in a lot of places where I'm at, we don't see the full range. And so just that's something that stuck with me recently, maybe a year ago at a conference, this idea of sharing the platform and thinking about how you can help others in that way.
Also thinking about different types of leadership.
Yeah.
Like what different styles of governance and different styles of leadership. And it's interesting because I am seeing this a little bit on the flip side with my son who's not a typical kind of male leader on his hockey team, but I'm constantly pointing out leading, that he's leading in different ways. So what are some of the stereotypes that we have around the way in which we expect leaders to be? And I think those are gendered. Mm-hmm. And how can we acknowledge and respect and make space for all of those different styles? So it may mean, like, you may have someone who doesn't want to speak, who doesn't feel as comfortable with public speaking, but maybe she would want to write something in a newspaper, or maybe she would want to be a part of a committee and contribute in that way. And so or maybe there's this whole thing around shine theory that we talk about in the equity and diversity world too, where if that person doesn't feel comfortable speaking out, that you would highlight her, and her work and her contributions by acknowledging, hey, this is, I noticed what Angel or whatever her name is said, and I wanted to echo that if you have a voice that is more strongly heard.
Yeah, it sounds like an amazing opportunity to lift them up with you when you have those opportunities. All right, next question. You that just arrived now. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your presentations. They were really interesting and inspiring. I'm a physiotherapist and I'm a PhD student at U of T. And I guess my question was mainly directed toward Huda, but I suppose everyone could chime in if they had anything to add. I am interested in sort of the knowledge translation field, so getting research and knowledge into practice. Most knowledge translation initiatives fail often miraculously. So I think that there needs to be some sort of infusion of other fields or technologies or, vision to get some of this basic science into, specifically in my case, the healthcare field. So I'm wondering if you had any insight into where we might be able to look, different fields or anything like that.
Yeah, our head of operations at Dot Health actually is a master's in knowledge translation. And what's interesting, I think, about technology in general, that the pendulum swung too far the other way. So we think everybody actually needs like very hardcore engineering skills. So if you don't have an engineering school degree or you don't have a comp sci degree, you're like useless in the technology field. But actually, what we're starting to recognize now is that the other thing that we've been ignoring, if you want to call it sort of the humanities end of it, or the arts end of it, the communication pieces are actually super important. So I would actually encourage you to look into, technology-specific companies that are entering into new fields. There's lots of legal tech. There's a ton of health tech. There's a ton of, Toronto specifically is home to a lot of sort of research-heavy groups. What are they looking for, and how could your skills either fit into that, or if there are ways that you can collaborate with something that you're bringing in, almost like a licensing deal. Like if you've come up with a framework of some sort, specifically within healthcare, what are other groups up and down University Avenue that are already working in that field, and could they collaborate with you or use something that you've already built in whatever their project is? And thankfully, we're now at a point where, most hospitals have, I know Women's does, an innovation group. And I think those are the exactly right people to reach out to say, hey, I have this sort of idea. Is it of any interest? There's the biomedical zone out of St. Michael's Hospital, which is doing something similar, which is, trying to bring together different types of people to build new innovation in health specifically. So I think tons of opportunity in the city, tons, out west as well. Typically out of universities, out of hospital networks, that could be cool. Best of luck.
So I'm not a techie, I use people. And so it's back to the whole community issue. And in our research, we involve community, and that's where we get the knowledge translation done. So we have community groups that help us plan the research, but then disseminate the research, and they take the research back to their groups. And similarly, when we have conferences with the basic science people, we make the basic scientists sit down with the community at the end of their lecture and talk it in understandable language that, again, then they can take back to their place. So that's an often way.
Anyone else want to give their input?
I was going to say, so my world now intersects with knowledge mobilization through science communication. And so it can be different audiences, whether that's researchers to policymakers or more frequently researchers to the public, which is the space I'm in. Partnership models, it's basically kind of what you're describing, and design thinking, I would say. The merger of those, that's what I heard. But it's thinking about your end user and involving them in the process and understanding what they want. So I was just at a policy conference, and how can researchers get their research, known by policymakers? Well, 20-page research documents aren't going to work. They need one-pagers. So just, it's really understanding each other's point of view and the needs, and then building the partnerships.
Do you have a follow-up, or? Only a million. All right, anybody else have a question for our panel?
I'm just briefly asking. I was thinking about, not necessarily, there might be a question, and there's something I want maybe think about as opposed to the AT. When you're considering the objects and you're moving in the car and the car's moving, are there going to be things put in for considering the wildlife that flies around or the moose that comes into the rural areas? How do we also protect our nature as well in accordance to driving in rural areas? Because I don't really like the idea of running into a squirrel. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but if there's a way to sort of at least preserve some of our wildlife, because our wildlife is very integrated with all of us. So that's something I'll ask you maybe to think about, or you already put that in. I don't know. And the question maybe is, how do we continue to inspire girls to do really, really well? I'm really fortunate. I just think outside of the box all the time because I'm an artisan. I'm not better than anybody. I'll tell you my secret. I do really well because I also listen to people who are not as skilled, and they inspire me and I inspire. My principle is no matter how seemingly people put one on this pedestal or not, every single video that wasn't something I was involved in, everybody's important. And everything is important, no matter what scale people involve it in, because there's something there for somebody to say. So that's all I have. Thank you very much for the panel.
Thank you for telling us a bit of your story. We appreciate it. I think maybe the question out of it are the animals part of the data?
So, thank you for your comment and for bringing it up. I happen to be vegan who cares a lot about animals, and when I went to ATG, that was one of the things that I was like, okay, I think not a lot of people care about this, but I'm going to make sure that we do. So it's definitely on my agenda. When I look at the technology, I make sure that there is something in there for the animals and that we are going to take better care of them. Because right now, whenever you go outside to the highways, outside the city, it's heartbreaking for me. So I think with autonomous vehicles, we should be able to actually prevent this problem from happening. And I also don't let anyone buy leather furniture for the office. So.
Talk about diversity of perspective.
Can I just
that
make
you'll
a
bring.
comment? Because I really loved what you said about that non-hierarchical approach, and that's really been critical for any researchers working with Indigenous communities and doing other community-based research too, is recognizing like when you come as an academic with all of your letters after your name, I tell people you have a particular skill, particular education. And when you're going into a particular community, there's a whole other level of experience and skill and knowledge, and that is absolutely critical to flatten that hierarchy if one wants to be able to effectively collaborate. So that was such a key point. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Right here.
Oh.
Just kind of going off what some people have already mentioned about the non-hierarchical approach or getting younger women involved in science. I'm a master's student in science communication and public engagement, and I have just a Bachelor of Science from U of T, but I didn't go to the master's or PhD level in in research or doing anything like that, but I still have a passion for science and communicating it to a lay audience, a general audience, whoever that is, whether it's the government, whatever the audience is, whether it's a community that's using an e-health tool to better their health. And I think an important point to possibly make is that girls can be interested in science at any level. It doesn't have to be research, or they don't have to get a PhD, but science can still be accessible to women, girls, whoever. And I'm kind of just maybe asking how you all in a research level, clinician, doctors, how do you involve girls or women in science in other areas that don't necessarily encourage them to go into get their PhD, that they can still be creative and ask questions and read about science? Yeah, just if any of you have experienced that.
Yeah, the work I do now is largely around, I would say, science literacy and creating a vibrant, robust science culture in Canada. And so that doesn't mean everyone's going to become, and our goal is certainly not for everyone to become a scientist. When we talk about science literacy, it's the hope that everyone can use the scientific process and appreciate it in their daily lives. I often find we have a funny relationship with science. It's something that happens in the classroom. Only the scientists in the lab coats are deemed scientists. We don't necessarily have that in other aspects of our life. You can value and enjoy music everywhere, every part of your life, and not be a professional musician. So we have an interesting relationship with science, and that would be a whole other topic that we can unpack as to why that might be. So I think what you were speaking to is something that I'm also passionate about, is this recognition of science in everyday life. And I think it is the responsibility to do that work outside of schools as well. I mean, this is why I'm leading the Association of Science Centers right now. I mean, largely, like, you can think that as a proxy for informal learning science. But that happens in many other places, not just science centers. So again, your family life. So thinking about that relationship, the language we use in daily, the things we honor, the things that we praise, even in our children. That was a great observation, you know? It's making it part of our culture. So thank you for bringing that up. I don't know if I answered the question.
Your point as well, because I think as a journalist, often the hardest part is we will talk to all kinds of experts like these women up here, and you're trying to distill it so that it can be communicated to the larger public. And I think when you don't need to have a PhD, I think that each and every one of us is instrumental in helping the public sort of bridge the gap sometimes where they exist, and you have that background. So you use those skills on a day-to-day basis, and when you hear stories or you know what is circulating, in my case in the media, I think it helps for you to raise your perspective and say, well, this is what I understand about this, especially given, the amount of information that's circulating these days. I think your knowledge is very powerful. All right, I think that was our last question. Thank you all.
There was a question here.
Oh,
Can we
so
take
sorry.
it?
Yes.
Hi, I just want to say thank you. I'm the co-president at the robotics team at my school, and one of the issues that I noticed, one of the issues that I noticed just in the team and in my school in general is the fact that people always have this one perspective on robotics, that it's for very smart people who are good at math or physics. And I feel like people don't realize that there's so many other aspects to science, not just the academic perspective. So I just want to know if you guys have any ideas of how I can encourage people at my school or my team to incorporate other passions that they have with science, even though they're not maybe thinking of going into science or pursuing science in the future, but just to, incorporate the skills they have. Or sometimes even on our team, we have people who don't take on the little projects that we have within the team because they think they're not good enough or they're not smart enough to do it itself. But I was just wondering if you guys had any ideas of how I can encourage people at my school and in my team of taking on those problems that are related to science, even though they don't think.
So how can she make it more accessible? How do you make science accessible to people who might not necessarily be all in?
I have a lot to say, but I'll wait.
So 12 years ago, I went to the first instance of a workshop for women in machine learning, which is this area of AI that I'm part of. That was the first one. And that was not my first scientific conference, but it was the first one where it was only women. And I was struck, it was very, very clear. I was struck by the fact that when these women talked about their research projects and what they're choosing to research using artificial intelligence, it was all applied towards important problems around health, around disabilities, around things that are tangible problems in the world that have nothing to do necessarily with robotics or AI, but they thought, okay, how can we bring the technology into solving this problem? And that struck me as very interesting. And there is research about it, which I later on found out. So women, okay, no one likes to stereotype, but women tend to be more motivated by the application to something that they view as a meaningful problem, whereas men often are very curious about just the core technology, and they don't, and they want to invest in that as opposed to thinking about where can it be applied. So if you encourage your friends to think about problems that they care about, and then think about, okay, and if I had a robot, could they help with it? Or if I had some sort of a machine that feels something. And I recently, I don't remember exactly the application, but I heard a couple of high school girls talk about this device that they attached, I think, to a walking cane, so that it has some sonar. It will inform the person with the a blind person that something is in their way, right? So this is not it's not about the math and the sensors as much as it is about how do we solve this problem.
All right, thank you all for your questions. They were amazing. Thank you all for your patience and your insight and your skills. All right, thank you.